So we're starting a new series today. We're starting a series called Still. At the start of the year, it's always good to kind of stop and center ourselves around God and around our faith, and just think again about how we experience God in our lives, how we encourage God's activity in our lives. And so, right at the start of the year, I thought it'd be really good to spend some time in the next few weeks thinking about how do we integrate the presence of God into our lives. And I thought this would be a good title for this series, Still. The psalmist writes in Psalm 46:10, he writes, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. And stillness is something that it's not vogue to be still in our current culture. It's not vogue. We fill our lives with activity normally. We fill our lives with interests and hobbies and responsibilities. And stillness isn't something that's very popular or something we really practice or we even be very good at, because we find it easier to hide ourselves in activity, really. We find it easier if we're active, if we're distracted, if we're doing something. Coming to stillness is something that we're not so good at anymore. I think the people who've gone before us, from the ancients in our faith, were probably better at practicing stillness, meditation, knowing God's presence than we are, because we've got so much going on in our lives. So I thought about this series, I thought about a graphic for it, and I thought about these pebbles kind of being still in the midst of all this activity around, with the sea washing in around them. And I think for us as people of faith, we need to figure out, how do we balance, how do we find a center in God in the midst of all the activity that we're currently surrounded by? We can't kind of step off the world, we can't step off the merry-go-round of activity that's in all our lives. But how do we find a center, how do we find a stillness in God that is going to keep us, our souls refreshed, keep us healthy, keep us balanced, keep us centered around the presence and the person of God? And it is challenging to try and balance and find this place, try and find this center, because we're surrounded by the continuum of life. John Mark McMillan, who I like, is a songwriter. He writes, life is heavy, but it just won't stop, in one of his songs. Life is heavy, but it just won't stop. And that's what it feels like sometimes. It feels like life is almost an attrition, that we're constantly facing changing circumstances and challenges and responsibilities, and things are continually coming against us. And sometimes life can feel really heavy, but you just can't stop it. There's no way to stop that continuum of life. And this relentless activity can feel quite overwhelming at times. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis, he wrote this. He said, "It comes the very moment you wake up each morning, all your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals. And the first job each morning consists simply in shoving them all back, in listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in, and so on all day. Standing back from all your natural fussing and fretting, coming in out of the wind." Now, C.S. wrote these words back in 1952, and the world was a very different place then, nearly 75 years ago. He knew nothing of the world we live in now. He knew nothing of modern technology and the pace at which life happens. He wasn't living a life that was dominated by mobile phone technology, by the internet, by the constant stream of information. But he still knew and experienced the wild animals of the human condition. He still knew what it felt like to wake in the morning and have all these responsibilities and fears come rushing at him every day as he woke. Lewis wouldn't have reached for his mobile phone the moment he woke up, because he simply wasn't around back in those days, but he still would have faced challenges. He still would have faced all this heaviness of activity coming towards him, the wild animals of the day. And he saw his first job in the morning as shoving them all back to make space to listen to what he describes as the other voice, to make space to listen to the voice of God. So let's pause for a moment there. What's the first voice you tend to hear in the morning? When you come to wake, what does that voice sound like? Now, I don't want you to be your spouse offering you a cup of tea, but what's that internal voice? What's that voice that you hear in the morning? Is it a positive voice speaking into your life? Is it a negative voice? What's the nature of the wild animals that come rushing at you in the morning as you come to consciousness? And they're different for all of us. They're different for all of us. So one of the questions we want to think about today is, how do we make space for the other voice, the voice of God, to be the voice that can come and speak into our lives, rather than just hearing the voice of activity and responsibility that comes towards us every morning? Now, you might not be a morning person. The thought of kind of pausing and stopping and listening to God first thing might be something that doesn't really fit for you. You might be a nighttime person. And this isn't really about times of day. It's about how do we make a space in our lives to allow God's voice to be the voice that speaks in. As C.S. says, that stronger, quieter voice. How do we make space to allow that voice of God to speak in, to help us deal with the wild animals that we face? Finding a way to let God speak into your life on a daily basis is really important for your spiritual well-being. Finding that place and that time to allow the voice of God to come and speak in. Because without it, we're just running on these other voices all the time. External voices, internal voices, all these different demanding voices. It's like we face 1,000 taskmasters every day, and none of them we can make happy, it seems, because they're all continually demanding our attention and our activity. How do we make space for the voice of God? So for you, your wild animals may take the form of worries or stresses, fears, insecurities, anxieties, responsibilities. Lewis encourages us to stand back from our natural fussing and fretting to let the larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. The full verse in Psalm 46 says, "He says, be still and know that I am God." He says, be still and know that I am God. And this means that the psalmist has somehow heard for himself these instructions spoken into his life. As he's writing this psalm, he's reflecting on what God has spoken into his life, what he's personally experienced about God calling him to stillness. The word here that's used in the original language is pronounced rophar, and it means to slacken or to be weak and to be still. So it means like a taking off of tension. It means a slackening. It means to become weak, to become vulnerable. It's not just about physical stillness. This is about a kind of a letting go, a reducing of intensity. And one of the key aspects of coming to stillness is recognizing our weakness, recognizing our vulnerability, recognizing our frailty. Because we fight that continually in our lives. We continually are trying to make ourselves strong. We're continually trying to will ourselves to be independent, to be able to cope, to be able to face whatever challenges, whatever the wild animals are in our lives. The last thing we want to be is weak before them. We want to be able to face them and be strong against them. But actually, part of finding spiritual wholeness and well-being is embracing our weakness, embracing our vulnerability. And that in itself helps to reduce the intensity in our lives. It helps us to come to a place where we can find rest for our souls. C.S. Lewis encourages us to come in out of the wind. Come in out of the wind. And for most of us, most days feel a little bit like this, don't they? They feel like we're being battered by just the intensity of life and all that life's throwing at us, coming in all directions, trying to face the wind. We're facing this whirlwind of activity and demands in our lives. One business coach describes it as the tyranny of the whirlwind. We constantly face this whirlwind of activity all around us all the time that just doesn't seem to stop. And when we're not facing that whirlwind of activity outside, we're facing the whirlwind of activity in our minds, inside as well. Because we've got these mental iterations continually going around in our heads like a whirlwind. A bit like what's happening with these guys.
So, how was the first day of school?
It was fine, I guess. I don't know.
Do you ever look at someone and wonder what is going on inside their head?
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure did.
Something's wrong.
We're gonna find out what's happening, but we'll need support. Signal the husband.
With a nice pass over to Reed, comes across center ice.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
What? Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What? What is it, woman? What?
Signal him again.
Ah, so, Riley, how was school?
You gotta be kidding me.
For this, we gave up that Brazilian helicopter pilot?
School was great, all right?
What was that? I thought you said we were gonna act casual.
Riley, is everything okay?
Sir, she just rolled her eyes at us.
All right, make a show of force. I don't want to have to put the foot down.
No, not the foot.
Riley, I do not like this new attitude.
Oh, I'll show you attitude, old man.
No, breathe.
What is your problem? Just leave me alone.
Sir, reporting high levels of sass.
Take it to DEFCON 2.
DEFCON 2.
I don't know where this disrespectful attitude came from.
You want a piece of this, Pops?
Yeah, well, look.
Prepare the foot.
Keys to safety position. Ready to launch on your command, sir.
Just shut up!
Fire!
That's it. Go to your room.
The foot is down. The foot is down. Woo!
Good job, gentlemen. That could have been a disaster.
Well, that was a disaster.
I don't know what goes on inside your head, but maybe that's... I think that's a gross oversimplification for the men there, don't you think? We've got these constant conversations going on in our heads, haven't we? All these different voices are in there, speaking, challenging, asking. We're sort of programmed as well by culture to be in a state of constant activity. That's what we find ourselves in. We're in a culture that's a 24/7 culture, 24/7 devices, 24/7 information. We're programmed now to be surrounded by activity. But what does God say to us? He says, be slack. Be slack. That's what this word means, to come to stillness. Be slack. Now, if you're like me, you associate that word with laziness, carelessness, inconsistency, unreliability, inefficiency. Who wants to be slack? Who wants to be a slack person? But this word hits at one of the root problems that we are facing us when it comes to practicing stillness before God. Because one of the reasons we don't want to come before God is that we struggle to face the reality actually that we are slack, we are weak, we are vulnerable. And when we come before God in stillness, we have to come to terms with that fact. We don't come before God in strength. We don't come before him in competence or with a list of all the things that we've just done and how good we are. When we come before God in stillness, we're facing the reality, actually, we are slack people, we are vulnerable people, we are frail people. We aren't God. We aren't God. And that's what we have to come to terms with when we come to a place of stillness and connection with God. One theologian puts it this way. He says, our deficiencies give more room for God's all-sufficiency. So coming before God in stillness is recognizing how deficient we are, how incapable we are really of doing life of facing all the challenges that life throws at us. And that's why many of us struggle to do it, because we've kidded ourselves that we are self-sufficient. We are all sufficient. We've kind of created within ourselves a construct that says, yeah, we can face whatever life throws at us. We can deal with whatever challenge life throws at us. The culture we're in doesn't really champion weakness. It challenges success. Sorry, it champions success. It champions people who can overcome or succeed or self-save. But coming to God, coming really into his presence, we're faced with that reality that we are deficient. We are incomplete. We are frail. But what that does is it makes space for God to be God in our lives. It gives God the opportunity to come and be God in our lives, because that's what God wants to do. God wants to be God to us. He doesn't want to come alongside as an equal or a peer. He wants to come and be who he is in all of his character, in all of his sufficiency. And so the psalmist says, come and be still and know who God is. Come and face your deficiencies, face your frailty, face your weakness, and in doing that, you will know who God is. You'll get to know who God is. Because in your weakness, God will show you his strength. In your frailty, God will show you his faithfulness. In your inconsistency, God will be there for you. God will show you, ultimately, his love. He'll show you his godliness. The Apostle Paul talked about this in his letter to the church in Corinth, a passage many of you are familiar with. He said, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And Paul's come to this reality that actually it isn't about his strength, it isn't about his completeness, it's all about God. He's been praying to God before this section, this letter, that God will come and deal with something he's struggling with, something is besetting him. We don't know what it is. It's not explained in the letter, but something is besetting him, and he wants God to come and fix it. But the revelation he gets actually is God saying, in the weakness of that, in the frailty of that, I'll show you my strength. I'll show you my faithfulness. And so he says, I'll delight in weakness, because God's power then comes to me. God's power then is then revealed in me. I get to know God better. So as we're thinking about learning to practice stillness and coming into God's presence, what we're doing is we're stopping occupying the space in our lives that God wants to occupy. We've used the phrase before, we're dethroning ourselves. We're stepping away from the steering wheel. We're stepping back and saying, God, this is the space that you should occupy in my life. This is the space that you should be in. So you can be God and I can be me. But many of us want to occupy the space that God wants to occupy. We want to self-save. But we're not in a position to do that. We're not in a position to deal with all that life throws at us. We're not really in a position to even deal with what's inside of ourselves. But yet, if we come before God, we can meet him in our vulnerability, in our weakness. And just like Paul, we can experience his power and his strength in our lives. So really, this isn't about you trying to think about how do I get a devotional life into my, sort of fitted into my busy schedule. This is more about us all at the start of your thinking about how can we get to know God better? How can we get to experience God's presence more? How can we find that balance of actually allowing the voice of God and the presence of God to be positioned correctly in our lives? Earlier in Psalm 46, the psalmist writes, "The river whose streams make glad the city of God." There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. And among all the big cities that time, Jerusalem lacked a river. It didn't have a natural water source coming in. But the psalmist speaks of a symbolic river flowing into the city, refreshing and nourishing the people of God, allowing life to come. And I know sometimes in Christian circles the whole river symbolism is a bit cliche, but what the psalmist is saying here, he says, as we practice stillness before God, we allow that provision of God to flow into our lives. There's a river of God that's available to us, that can nourish us and sustain us, that can flow into our lives. It's not a natural river. It's not something physical or tangible, but it's there, and we can experience it. To use C.S. Lewis's language, it's that larger, stronger, quieter life that can come flowing in to our lives. And if we don't connect to that life of God on a regular basis, then we start to struggle. We start to display all sorts of different symptoms in our lives as we try and self-save, as we try and deal with life's struggles ourselves. And some of the things you and I might experience, irritability. We get angry easily, we lose our temper, we become cynical, we become pessimistic, we become sarcastic. Our thinking turns towards the negatives because we're struggling with dealing with the attrition of life. We haven't got the resources. We're running on fumes. And so we can become irritable. We can become restless. We just can't relax. We can't stop. We can't come to stillness. We can't seem to find peace. Our minds seem to be continually whirring all the time. So we bury ourselves in activity. We might find ourselves compulsively overworking. We get lost in our job. We get lost in activities. We get lost in hobbies. We get lost in sports. It doesn't matter what it is, but we try and stop all those voices by burying ourselves into activity. Or perhaps we experience numbness. We find it hard to feel. We find it hard to care. We find that the things that used to give us pleasure don't give us pleasure anymore. We find it difficult to find happiness and joy. Or we might try escapist behaviours. We might retreat into all sorts of things to try and escape the attrition of life. TV, social media, alcohol, food, sport, you name it. 101 things we can retreat into to try and self-save. We can disconnect from our identity. We lose sight of who we are, our purpose, our goals, where we're heading, what we're for. We might even start hoarding our energy and resources. We might start withdrawing into ourselves, feeling anxious and insecure about the future, already feeling like we're lacking, but not knowing why. And you might experience any one of the things on this list. You might experience a number of them, but they can all be like warning lights on the dashboard of your life that indicate to you and I that our lives are out of balance, that we need to do something. We need to allow that river of God back into our lives to nourish us and sustain us. Because what these things say is you're not doing well at life. You aren't self-sufficient like you think you are. These are symptoms, these are warning lights on the dashboard of your life to say you aren't succeeding like you think you are. And the only person that can help, truly help, is God, allowing God's presence back into our lives. The Dutch priest Henry Nouwen said, without solitude, it is almost impossible to live a spiritual life. And what he meant by that was, unless we find a way to withdraw from distraction, unless we find a way to withdraw from activity and allow God to come into our lives, we're really going to struggle. We're really going to struggle to maintain a spiritual life. So solitude and stillness are really important when we think about our spiritual vitality. And the reason they're important is because what they help us to do is they help us to give our attention to God. The poet Mary Oliver wrote this. She said, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." Attention is the beginning of devotion. What does it mean to give something your attention? Well, it means to direct your mind, to listen, to see, to understand, to focus on something or someone. The problem is we live in a culture which encourages us to be inattentive, encourages us to divide our attention, to dilute our attention, to distract our attention across a number of different things simultaneously, to move quickly from one thing to the next, keeping our attention moving all the time. The problem with this is we may never feel fully present. We may never feel fully satisfied because our attention jumps from one thing to the next to the next. And Mary said, attention is the beginning of devotion. And for her, she was a famous prize-winning poet, and she would go out and walk into the world with her eyes open, carrying a simple notebook. And she would pay attention to the things that she saw. It might be something as simple as a weed growing through a crack in a pavement or a pebble in a stream. But these are the things that she would give her attention to. And she would begin to see how God had woven all these things together in his love. And for her, her attention became the beginning of devotion because more of God was revealed to her as she paid attention to creation around her. But if we're never fully present, if we're never fully attentive, then we're being robbed of experiencing that love that God has for us and wants to show to us. See, everything we do, even the simplest thing, a conversation, enjoying a meal with someone, going for a walk, doing a chore, everything is better if we give it our attention. Everything is better and more satisfying if we give it our attention. But we live in a world that is basically continually trying to pull our attention away. You see, our attention, it's like our superpower. It's like our superpower. When you choose to give something your attention, really, truly, it's a marvelous thing to do. Have you ever been on the end of a conversation where you know the person you're talking to is fully attentive, is fully listening to you, is fully engaged? It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Contrast that with a conversation where somebody is clearly, their mind is elsewhere. They're focused on something else. They're focused on the next thing. It's a very, very different experience, isn't it? Or sitting down for a meal with somebody, or with friends, and you feel present in the room. You feel the attention is there in the room. The focus is in the room. It's a powerful experience, isn't it? You feel united. You feel community. You feel love. You feel something deeply satisfying. Contrast that with a meal where phones are out and buzzing and people are distracted, and it's a very different experience. Our attention is our superpower. And when we choose to give each other our attention, when we choose to give God our attention, it's a transformative experience. But we're battling a culture that is continually vying for our attention. We've got to think about, how do we use it wisely? How do we use it wisely? If we give God our attention, if we come to stillness, if we focus and listen and try and see and understand, then we will encounter God in a different way. We will feel renewed. We will feel refreshed. We will feel new hope in our hearts. We'll feel love because our attention will allow that devotion to begin between us and God. But if our attention is diverted or distracted or diluted, you see, our attention's a fickle thing. It's a fickle thing. Every shiny new thing that comes bouncing past, we're transfixed. Our attention flicks. Even in a room, if someone gets up, like today, and walks towards the door, you've gone. Your attention is on that person, not me anymore. Our attention is a fickle thing. But that shiny little thing that comes bouncing past, it doesn't nourish the soul. So we look for the next thing, and we look for the next thing, and we look for the next thing. And our attention is constantly getting distracted and diverted. So we don't fully hear, we don't fully see, we don't fully understand. Proverbs 27:20 says that human eyes are never satisfied. In fact, the proverb is a bit more powerful. It says it's like death and destruction. Human eyes are never satisfied. And the psalmist knows that our eyes are constantly being distracted. Our eyes are constantly looking for the next new shiny thing. And our current technology and culture only aggravates this trait within us, doesn't it? We carry these devices that are perfectly designed to capture our attention in a myriad of ways. Perfectly designed technology designed to capture your attention and to a degree your devotion. But what they also do is they create a state of dissatisfaction in our lives. Now, if you spent a long time on your phone, you probably don't come away feeling really satisfied and joyful, do you? You probably come away thinking, well, that was a waste of time. I didn't feel very satisfying. I still feel a bit empty. I still feel a bit lacking. I still feel a bit like I'm missing out. I still feel a bit dissatisfied. They're very good at creating dissatisfaction within us because we never really give something enough attention to move into devotion, to move into satisfaction. And what the act of stillness can do, which we're talking about today, it can bring our attention to heal. It can bring our attention to heal, like an obedient dog. I'm going to come into this place and I'm going to be still, and you're going to come with me, attention, and you're going to sit there, a heel, and we're going to wait, and we're going to focus our attention on God. And we're going to try and see, and we're going to try and hear, and we're going to try and understand. We can bring our attention to heal. And that's what stillness can do. It can help us begin those acts of devotion with God. Because our attention is the gateway to devotion. You know, people say to me, I really struggle with, to spend time with God. But are you coming to stillness? Are you putting your phone in a different room? Are you trying to bring your attention to heal so you can focus in on God? What are you doing to help you in that process? And again, I know we're all wired differently, and some of us are activists, and some of us like to be still, and some are introverts, and some are extroverts, but we all face the same challenge, guys. How do we be still and let God be God in our lives? Because if we want to experience devotion, if we want to experience the love of God in our lives, we want to let the love of God flow through us, then it begins as we bring our attention, as we come to stillness before God. So I know at the start of this year, you have all these wild animals facing you, don't you? Lots of different wild animals facing you, different circumstances and situations and challenges and fears and worries and concerns. You can come to God with all of them. You don't have to be strong on your own. You don't have to self-save. You don't have to be self-sufficient. You can come to God in vulnerability and weakness. You can be slack before him and allow God to be God in your situation. Because he has provision for you, he has plans for you, he has purpose for you, he has love for you, he has unseen things for you. He's inviting us into those things again. Our part to play is to allow that stronger, quieter voice of God to flow into our lives as often as we can. Because in our weakness, God's strength is demonstrated. He can do the heavy lifting in our lives. We don't have to retreat into self-saving behaviors. He can do the heavy lifting. So as we finish today, I want to have a moment of stillness. You've been very still and very attentive, and I think you're amazing, so thank you. God's here. Why don't you just close your eyes and let's just have a moment of stillness. Think about your year ahead. Maybe think about all the things that you are facing. Some of them might seem scary, some of them you're looking forward to. Some of them you're unsure about. Now try and turn your attention to God. However you can do that. Just try and think about God. Turn your attention to God. Try and focus on him. And just picture yourself giving those things to God, bringing those things to him. And just allow yourself to be weak for a moment. Allow yourself to feel the don't knows, the uncertainty, the unsures. Just allow yourself to be weak. Just rest in him. It might be difficult for you to do that. That might take some practice. You might be resistant to that. It's a bit like a trust exercise. Just allow yourself to be weak before him. Just say, God, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how things are going to work out. I don't know how to sort this situation. And in the stillness, let's just let God be God in our lives again. He wants to bring all that he has into your life. But he only does that as we allow him, as we partner with him, as we dethrone ourselves. So Lord, at the start of this new year, help us to practice stillness. Help us to practice your presence. Now, these next few weeks, God, we want to grow in this area. We want to get better at hearing your voice, at seeing and understanding you. So Lord, would you begin to help us to slacken the intensity in our lives, the activity in our lives, to make space for you. And we ask this in your precious name. Amen.